Imagine waking up on a Monday morning. The sun is rising over a quiet California neighborhood. Children are getting ready for school, tying their shoes, grabbing their backpacks. Parents are making breakfast, pouring orange juice, reminding their kids to brush their teeth. It's an ordinary day, a safe day, or at least it should be. But across the street from Cleveland Elementary School, a 16-year-old girl is loading a rifle. She positions herself on her front porch. She takes aim at the playground below. And when those children step on his school grounds, she opens fire. 30 shots. 2 people dead. 8 children wounded. A community shattered. And when a reporter asks her why she did it, her answer becomes one of the most infamous phrases in criminal history. I don't like Mondays. 3 words that would echo through the decades. 3 words that would raise more questions than they answered. 3 words that would leave a nation asking, how could this happen? This is the story of Brenda Spencer, the teenager who turned a school into a shooting gallery. The girl who received a rifle as a Christmas present and used it to kill. The woman who, 46 years later, is fighting for her freedom while her victims fight to keep her behind bars. This is a story about violence without clear motive, about trauma that never fades, and about one survivor who refuses to let the world forget what happened that day. I'm your host, and today, we're examining a case that shocked America and changed the way we think about school safety forever. Let's begin. January 29th, 1979. San Carlos, California. A suburban community nestled in the San Francisco Bay Area, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, where kids rode bikes until dark, where schools felt safe. Cleveland Elementary School sat on a quiet residential street. A typical California elementary school, with colorful playground equipment, chain-link fences, and portable classrooms. It served kindergarten through 6th grade, educating hundreds of children from the surrounding neighborhoods. That Monday morning began like any other. Teachers arrived early, unlocking classrooms and writing the day's lessons on chalkboards. The crossing guard took his position at the corner. Parents drove up in station wagons and sedans, kissing their children goodbye before heading to work. 9-year-old Cam Miller was one of those children walking toward the school gates. He was in 4th grade, a regular kid with a regular life. He liked sports. He had friends. He was looking forward to recess. Cam walked with a group of other students, their voices carrying through the crisp morning air. They talked about weekend plans, about television shows, about the kind of trivial things that occupy a 9-year-old's mind. They had no reason to feel afraid. They had no reason to look up at the house across the street. But someone was watching them. In a modest single-story home directly facing the school, Brenda Spencer stood at her window. She had barely slept that weekend. She had spent most of Sunday drinking alcohol and staring at the elementary school from her bedroom. And now, on Monday morning, she had made her decision. She picked up her rifle, a Ruger 1022, a .22 caliber semi-automatic weapon that her father had given her for Christmas. She had asked for a radio. She had wanted music, something to fill the silence of her lonely bedroom. Instead, her father bought her a gun and 500 rounds of ammunition. She loaded the weapon. She walked to the front door. She stepped out onto her porch, and she started shooting. The first shots rang out at approximately 8:30 in the morning. Children were still arriving at school. Some were already on the playground. Others were walking through the gate. The principal was greeting students at the entrance. Cam Miller heard screaming before he understood what was happening. He saw other kids dropping to the ground. He saw adults running. And then, suddenly, he felt nothing. I went numb on the left side, Cam would later recall. I blacked out. One of his neighbors saw him collapse. She ran toward him, thinking he had fainted or tripped. When she reached him, she saw blood. Cam had been shot, the bullet entering his back and exiting through his chest, missing his heart by less than an inch. It went clear through, from the back to the front, Cam explained years later. Fortunately, it missed all my organs and any internal parts. But Cam wasn't the only one hit. All around him, children were falling, screaming, running, trying to understand why their Monday morning had turned into a nightmare. Inside the school, teachers heard the gunfire and immediately went into action. Some pulled children into classrooms and locked the doors. Others crawled across the playground, dragging wounded students to safety. The sounds of gunshots echoed across the campus, sharp cracks that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And across the street, Brenda Spencer kept firing. She aimed methodically, carefully, as if she were at a shooting range and not targeting living human beings. She reloaded when her magazine emptied. She adjusted her position to get a better angle. She showed no emotion, no hesitation, no remorse. And then she aimed at the adults who were trying to help. Burton Ragg was 53 years old. He had been the principal of Cleveland Elementary School for several years, beloved by students and respected by parents. He was known for his kindness, his dedication, and his willingness to go above and beyond for the children in his care. When Burton heard the gunshots, he didn't run for cover. He didn't hide. He ran toward the danger. He saw children lying on the ground, wounded and terrified. He saw kids frozen in fear, unable to move. And he knew he had to get them to safety. Burton ran onto the playground, his arms outstretched, trying to shield students with his own body. He called out to them, telling them to run, to get inside, to stay low. He was trying to save lives. Brenda Spencer shot him. The bullet struck Burton in the chest. He fell to the ground, mortally wounded, but he kept moving. Even as he was dying, he tried to reach the children around him, tried to pull them to safety. His last moments on Earth were spent protecting others. Mike Sucher was 56 years old. He was the school's head custodian, a quiet man who took pride in keeping the campus clean and safe. He fixed broken equipment. He painted over graffiti. He made sure the children had a nice place to learn. When Mike heard the gunshots, he saw what Burton was doing. He saw the principal trying to save children while under fire. And Mike knew he couldn't stand by and do nothing. He grabbed a makeshift shield, a piece of wood, a door, anything he could find, and ran toward the playground. He shouted at the children to get behind him. He tried to provide cover so they could escape. Brenda Spencer shot him too. Mike fell near Burton, both men giving their lives in an attempt to protect children who weren't even their own. They were heroes in every sense of the word. They had seconds to make a decision, and they chose selflessness over survival. 2 men, 2 lives, 2 families that would never be the same. But Brenda Spencer wasn't finished. She continued firing at the children who were still exposed. She shot at the police officers who were beginning to arrive. She sent 30 rounds across that playground in a matter of minutes, creating carnage that no one in that quiet California town could have ever imagined. By the time the shooting stopped, 8 children had been wounded. 2 adults were dead. A police officer had been injured, and the entire community was in shock. And Brenda Spencer? She walked back in her house, locked the door, and barricaded herself inside. Within minutes, San Carlos police surrounded the Spencer home. Patrol cars blocked off the street. Officers took positions behind vehicles, their weapons drawn, not knowing if the shooter would open fire on them next. Neighbors were evacuated. Parents who had heard about the shooting rushed to the scene, desperate to find their children, to know if they were safe. The school went into lockdown. Ambulances arrived, paramedics rushing to treat the wounded while trying to stay out of the line of fire. Inside her house, Brenda Spencer was calm. She had a rifle. She had ammunition. And she had no intention of coming out. The standoff lasted for hours. Negotiators tried to make contact, calling the house phone, tried to talk her into surrendering. For a long time, she didn't answer. And then, a reporter from a local radio station had an idea. He looked up the phone number for the Spencer residence and called it himself. And to everyone's surprise, Brenda Spencer answered. The conversation was brief, but chilling. The reporter identified himself and asked a question everyone wanted answered. Why did you do this? There was a pause. And then Brenda Spencer said something that would define this case for decades to come. I don't like Mondays. This livens up the day. The reporter pressed her for more details. He asked if she had planned this. He asked if she regretted it. He asked if she understood that people were dead. Brenda's responses were cold, almost flippant. She said she had been thinking about it all weekend. She said she had nothing better to do. She said the kids made easy targets because they were just standing there. There was no remorse in her voice. No tears. No recognition of the magnitude of what she had done. She spoke as if she were describing a video game, not a massacre. The call was recorded. It was broadcast on the radio, and it horrified everyone who heard it. How could a 16-year-old girl be so detached from reality? How could she speak about killing people as if it were nothing more than a way to pass the time? What kind of person does something like this? Those questions would haunt investigators, psychologists, and the victims' families for years to come. Finally, after nearly 7 hours, Brenda Spencer agreed to surrender. She walked out of her house with her hands up, was taken into custody, and was transported to juvenile detention. The shooting was over, but the nightmare was just beginning. Cam Miller woke up in a hospital bed, confused and in pain. He didn't fully understand what had happened. He knew he had been shot, but the details were fuzzy. His parents were there, tears streaming down their faces, grateful that he was alive. The doctors told him he was lucky. The bullet had passed through his body without hitting any vital organs. He wouldn't need surgery. He would recover, but he would carry the physical and emotional scars for the rest of his life. Cam was one of the lucky ones. The 8 wounded children all survived, though their injuries ranged from minor to severe. Some spent weeks in the hospital. Some needed multiple surgeries. All of them would need therapy. But Bert and Rag and Mike Sutcher weren't coming back. Their families were left to mourn, to plan funerals, to try to make sense of senseless violence. The community of San Carlos was devastated. Parents kept their children home from school. Families moved away. The sense of safety that had once defined this quiet suburb was gone, replaced by fear and suspicion. And everyone wanted to know, how could this happen? What could have been done to prevent it? And most importantly, who was Brenda Spencer? Brenda Ann Spencer was born on April 3rd, 1962, in San Diego, California. She grew up in a working-class family, the daughter of Wallace Spencer, a man described by neighbors as strict and emotionally distant. Brenda's childhood was marked by dysfunction. Her parents divorced when she was young, and she lived with her father in that small house across from Cleveland Elementary School. By all accounts, it was not a happy home. Friends and classmates described Brenda as a loner. She didn't have many friends. She didn't participate in school activities. She often wore the same clothes day after day, and some students made fun of her for it. But there were warning signs that went beyond social isolation. Brenda had a fascination with guns. She liked to shoot at birds and windows with a BB gun. She talked about violence in a casual, detached way that made some people uncomfortable. In the months leading up to the shooting, Brenda's behavior became even more concerning. She skipped school frequently. She drank alcohol. She seemed depressed, angry, disconnected. And then, for Christmas, her father gave her a rifle. Years later, people would ask, what was Wallace Spencer thinking? Why would you give a troubled teenager a firearm? Did he not see the warning signs? Did he not care? Wallace Spencer would later say that he gave his daughter the rifle because she asked for it. He said she liked to shoot at cans in the backyard. He said he thought it would be a good way for her to practice marksmanship. But others saw it differently. They saw it as a father who was either oblivious to his daughter's mental state or simply didn't care. They saw it as negligence, as a failure of parenting that contributed to tragedy. Regardless of his intentions, the result was clear. Brenda Spencer had easy access to a deadly weapon. And on January 29th, 1979, she used it. Brenda Spencer was arrested and charged as an adult, despite being only 16 years old. She faced 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Bert and Rag and Mike Sutcher, as well as multiple counts of assault with a deadly weapon for the children and police officers she wounded. The legal system had a decision to make. Should Brenda be tried as a juvenile or as an adult? Given the severity of the crimes and the number of victims, prosecutors argued that she should face adult charges. The judge agreed. Brenda Spencer pled guilty to all charges. There was no trial, no lengthy legal battle, no jury deliberation. She admitted to everything she had done. At her sentencing hearing in April of 1979, the courtroom was packed with victims' families, survivors, community members, and reporters. Everyone wanted to see the girl who had caused so much pain. Brenda sat quietly, showing little emotion. When given the opportunity to speak, she offered no apology. She gave no explanation beyond what she had already said. I don't like Mondays. The judge sentenced her to 25 years to life in prison, concurrent sentences for each count of murder, with the possibility of parole. She was sent to the California Institution for Women, where she would spend the next several decades. But even behind bars, the questions didn't stop. Why did she do it? Was there more to the story? And would she ever truly take responsibility for her actions? Over the years, Brenda Spencer's explanation for the shooting changed. What started as "I don't like Mondays" evolved into a series of different narratives, each one attempting to justify or explain her actions. At her first parole hearing, which took place in 1993, 14 years after the shooting, Brenda claimed that she had been under the influence of drugs at the time of the attack. "I'd been using drugs all that weekend," she told the parole board. "LSD and PCP. I wasn't in my right mind." But there was a problem with that story. Toxicology tests performed immediately after her arrest showed no traces of any drugs in her system. She was completely sober when she opened fire on those children. When confronted with this evidence, Brenda changed her story again. She claimed that she had been drinking heavily and that alcohol had impaired her judgment. But even that explanation didn't hold up. Witnesses who saw her during the standoff said she appeared lucid and in control. So Brenda tried a different approach. She began to allege that her father had abused her throughout her childhood, physically, emotionally, and sexually. "He would touch me inappropriately," Brenda claimed in later hearings. "He controlled every aspect of my life. I was terrified of him." She suggested that the shooting was a cry for help, a desperate act by a traumatized teenager who didn't know how else to escape her situation. Wallace Spencer vehemently denied these allegations. He said his daughter was lying, that she was trying to manipulate the system, that she was attempting to gain sympathy by portraying herself as a victim. Unfortunately, Wallace Spencer passed away in 2005, so he was never able to fully defend himself against these accusations. And without concrete evidence one way or the other, the truth remains murky. Some people believe Brenda's claims of abuse. They point to her troubled childhood, her isolation, her father's decision to give her a gun. They argue that she was a damaged person who lashed out in the only way she knew how. Others believe Brenda is lying. They point to the lack of evidence, the changing stories, the fact that she showed no remorse in the immediate aftermath of the shooting. They argue that she's a manipulator who is trying to avoid taking full responsibility for her actions. The parole board has consistently sided with the latter view. Brenda Spencer has been denied parole multiple times, most recently in 2021. Each time, the board cites the severity of her crimes, the inconsistency of her explanations, and the continued threat she poses to public safety. But Brenda keeps trying, and each time she does, the survivors are forced to relive the worst day of their lives. Cam Miller is now in his 50s. He's a husband, a father, a productive member of society. He has a career. He has hobbies. He has a life. But he also has a mission. For over 4 decades, Cam has attended nearly every one of Brenda Spencer's parole hearings. He sits in the back of the room, often joined by other survivors and family members of the victims, and he listens as Brenda makes her case for release. And then he speaks. Cam tells the parole board what it was like to be 9 years old and get shot on the way to school. He describes the physical pain, the surgeries, the nightmares. He talks about the fear that stayed with him for years, the anxiety every time he saw a stranger, the way he would instinctively look for exits wherever he went. He talks about Burton Ragg and Mike Sucher, 2 men who died trying to protect children. He reminds the board that those men don't get a second chance. Their families don't get them back. Their grandchildren never got to meet them. And he makes it clear that he does not believe Brenda Spencer should ever be released. She's a loose cannon, Cam has said in multiple hearings. I think the whole community would be in danger. You never know whether she'll go after somebody who's testified against her. You just never know what her mindset is going to be. Attending these hearings isn't easy for Cam. Each one forces him to confront the trauma he's tried so hard to move past. Each one requires him to take time off work, to travel to the prison, to sit across from the woman who nearly killed him. It is a little eerie, Cam admitted in one interview, to see somebody that almost killed me. But he keeps showing up, not just for himself, but for the others. Some of the survivors have moved on with their lives and don't want to be involved. Some are still too traumatized to face Brenda Spencer in person. Some have passed away. But Cam feels a responsibility to represent them all. If you can keep her behind bars and help one other person who's gone through something like this, Cam said, it makes it all worth it for me. Cam's dedication has not gone unnoticed. Other survivors have thanked him for his diligence. Victims' advocacy groups have praised his commitment. Even the prosecutors who handle the parole hearings rely on his testimony to provide a victim's perspective. But Cam doesn't do it for recognition. He does it because he believes it's the right thing to do. He does it because he remembers what it was like to be a 9-year-old boy who just wanted to go to school. He does it because he knows that if he doesn't speak up, Brenda Spencer might one day walk free. And that's a risk he's not willing to take. The impact of the Cleveland Elementary School shooting extends far beyond the immediate victims. It ripples through families, through communities, through generations. Burton Ragg left behind a wife and children who had to learn how to live without him. His grandchildren grew up hearing stories about the grandfather they never met, the hero who gave his life to save others. Mike Sucher's family experienced the same grief. His wife became a widow. His children lost their father. His legacy became one of tragedy mixed with heroism. The 8 wounded children grew up carrying the physical and emotional scars of that day. Some struggled with PTSD. Some had difficulty trusting others. Some developed anxiety disorders that affected their education, their careers, their relationships. And it wasn't just the direct victims who suffered. The entire community of San Carlos was changed by the shooting. Parents became more protective. Schools implemented new security measures. The sense of innocence that had once defined childhood in that town was replaced by a new reality. Nowhere is completely safe. The shooting also had a broader impact on American society. It contributed to the national conversation about gun control, about school safety, about how we identify and help troubled youth before they become dangerous. It inspired the song I Don't Like Mondays by the Boomtown Rats, which became a hit in 1979. The song brought international attention to the case. but it also raised ethical questions about whether it was appropriate to turn a tragedy into entertainment. And it set a precedent. Cleveland Elementary was one of the first widely publicized school shootings in American history. It showed that these kinds of attacks could happen anywhere at any time, carried out by anyone, even a teenage girl. In the decades since, school shootings have become tragically more common. Columbine, Sandy Hook, Parkland, Uvalde. Each one echoes the horror of what happened in San Carlos in 1979. But Cleveland Elementary stands out for one reason: the perpetrator's explanation. I don't like Mondays. No political ideology. No clear vendetta. Just a casual, almost absurd justification for taking human lives. And that, perhaps, is what makes this case so unsettling. We want to believe that violence has a reason, that we can understand it, that we can prevent it by addressing root causes. But sometimes, the answer is disturbingly simple. Sometimes, people do terrible things for reasons that make no sense at all. Brenda Spencer became eligible for parole in 1993, 25 years into her sentence. Since then, she has had multiple parole hearings, each one an opportunity for her to make her case for release. At each hearing, Brenda has presented herself as a changed person. She claims to have undergone therapy. She says she has taken responsibility for her actions. She argues that she was a troubled teenager who made a terrible mistake, but that she is no longer that person. But the parole board hasn't been convinced. At her 1993 hearing, the board noted her lack of consistent remorse and her shifting explanations for the shooting. They denied parole and set her next hearing for several years later. At her 2001 hearing, Brenda claimed that she had been sexually abused by her father and that this trauma had contributed to her actions. The board acknowledged the seriousness of such allegations, but noted that there was no corroborating evidence. They denied parole again. At her 2009 hearing, Brenda broke down in tears and said she was deeply sorry for what she had done. She said she thought about the victims every day. She said she wished she could take it back. But the board noted that she had shown little emotion at previous hearings, and they questioned whether her display of remorse was genuine. Parole was denied. At her 2017 hearing, Cam Miller was there, along with family members of Burton Ragg and Mike Sucher. They testified about the ongoing impact of the shooting, about the lives that were destroyed, about the pain that never truly goes away. The board denied parole once again, stating that Brenda Spencer continued to pose an unreasonable risk to public safety. And at her most recent hearing in 2021, the same thing happened. Despite Brenda's claims of rehabilitation, despite her expressions of regret, the board determined that she should remain incarcerated. Each denial comes with a new hearing date, typically set for several years in the future. And each time, the survivors must decide whether they have the strength to show up and tell their stories one more time. For Cam Miller, the answer has always been yes. She doesn't deserve a second chance, Cam has said repeatedly. The two people who were killed did not receive a second chance. I think she deserves to stay behind bars. But the question remains, will there ever come a time when the parole board decides differently? Will Brenda Spencer, now in her 60s, eventually be deemed safe enough to release? And if that day comes, how will the survivors react? The case of Brenda Spencer raises difficult questions that go beyond the specifics of this one crime. First, there's the question of juvenile justice. Should a 16-year-old be tried as an adult, even for the most serious crimes? Brenda's brain was still developing when she committed the shooting. Research has shown that teenagers are more impulsive, less able to foresee consequences, and more susceptible to peer pressure and environmental influences than adults. But does that excuse what she did? Does it mean she deserves leniency? Or does the severity of the crime, 2 murders, 8 attempted murders, outweigh any consideration of her age? Second, there's the question of parole. Brenda was sentenced to 25 years to life, which means she was always going to have the possibility of release. But after 46 years in prison, should she be given a chance at freedom? Has she served enough time? Has she been sufficiently punished? Or is the nature of her crime so heinous that she should never be released, regardless of how much time has passed? Third, there's the question of rehabilitation. Can someone who commits such an act ever truly change? Can therapy, education, and time transform a person who was once capable of cold-blooded violence? Some people believe in redemption. They believe that even the worst offenders can become better, that the purpose of prison should be rehabilitation, not just punishment. Others believe that certain crimes are unforgivable. They believe that someone who takes innocent lives has forfeited their right to freedom, regardless of how remorseful they claim to be. And finally, there's the question of what justice means. Is justice about punishment, rehabilitation, deterrence, closure for victims? For Cam Miller and the other survivors, justice means keeping Brenda Spencer in prison. It means ensuring that she never has the opportunity to hurt anyone else. It means honoring the memory of Burton Ragg and Mike Sucher by making sure their killer remains behind bars. But for Brenda Spencer, justice might mean something different. It might mean the chance to prove she's changed, to live out her remaining years in freedom, to try to make amends in whatever way she can. These are questions without easy answers. And are questions that the parole board must grapple with every time Brenda Spencer comes before them. As of now, in 2025, Brenda Spencer remains incarcerated at the California Institution for Women. She is 62 years old. She has spent the majority of her life in prison, more than twice as long as she lived in freedom. Cleveland Elementary School no longer exists. The building was torn down years ago, and the land has been redeveloped into housing. New families live there now, many of them unaware of the tragic history of that site. But the memory of what happened has not faded. The community of San Carlos has not forgotten, and the survivors continue to carry the weight of that day. Cam Miller is still actively involved in ensuring that Brenda Spencer stays behind bars. He has become an advocate for victims' rights, speaking at events, and working with organizations that support those affected by violent crime. The families of Burton Ragg and Mike Sucher continue to honor their loved ones. They attend memorial services. They share stories with younger generations. They make sure that the sacrifice those two men made is never forgotten. And every few years, when Brenda Spencer comes up for parole, they all gather once again. They tell their stories. They relive their pain. They fight to make sure that the woman who destroyed so many lives remains behind bars. Brenda Spencer's next parole hearing is scheduled for 2025. It will be her 6th or 7th hearing, depending on how you count them. And once again, Cam Miller will be there. This is reality, Cam has said. And if you can keep her behind bars and help one other person who's gone through something like this, it makes it all worth it for me. The story of Brenda Spencer is one that refuses to fade into history. It's a story that continues to resonate because it touches on so many fundamental questions about human nature, about justice, about how we respond to senseless violence. It's a story about a Monday morning that started like any other and ended in tragedy. About children who went to school and came home wounded or not at all. About heroes who gave their lives trying to protect others. About a community that was shattered and had to find a way to rebuild. It's a story about a 16-year-old girl who, for reasons that may never be fully understood, decided to open fire on innocent people. About a father who gave his daughter a gun. About warning signs that were either missed or ignored. It's a story about survivors who refuse to be defined by their trauma. About a 9-year-old boy who grew up to be a man dedicated to ensuring that justice is served. About families who turn their grief into advocacy. And it's a story that asks us to consider difficult questions. What do we owe to victims of violence? What do we owe to offenders who claim to have changed? How do we balance punishment with rehabilitation? How do we prevent tragedies like this from happening again? There are no easy answers. But these are questions we must continue to ask, conversations we must continue to have, lessons we must continue to learn. Because 46 years after the Cleveland Elementary School shooting, the threat of violence in our schools has not gone away. If anything, it has gotten worse. And the only way to honor the memory of Burton Ragg, Mike Sucher, and all the victims of school violence is to keep working toward a world where children can go to school without fear. That's the legacy of January 29th, 1979. That's the unthinkable case that continues to haunt us decades later. And that's why we must never forget. So what do you think? Should Brenda Spencer be granted parole? Has she served enough time for her crimes? Or should she remain in prison for the rest of her life? These are questions worth considering. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this case as compelling and disturbing as I did, please hit that like button. Subscribe to cases so you never miss a story. And turn on notifications because we're going to continue exploring the most shocking, most tragic, and most thought-provoking true crime cases from around the world. Share this video with someone who's interested in true crime, in criminal justice, or in the ongoing conversation about how we keep our schools safe. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to the stories of these victims and survivors. And thank you for caring about justice. I'll see you in the next case.